Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide. In this podcast, we tour the towns and cities of England and dive into their history. How did a town come to be? What are the stories of the people that lived there, and what can we see today? And in this episode, we're visiting Nottingham. It's a city you've probably heard of. It's got a very famous name. Many listeners will have heard of the Sheriff of Nottingham and, of course, Robin Hood. But as we'll see in this episode, the story of Nottingham is less really about Robin Hood, although the castle site is of extreme importance to the city, and it's of national significance, as we'll see. We'll also learn about the importance of lace manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, Nottingham as an industrial city, and the impact that's had on the architecture of the city. But before all of that, let's first do introductions. I'm Liam McGrath, and I'm delighted to introduce historian Daniel Gooch. Now, Daniel, are you a fan of the tales of Robin Hood?
Well, I'll say my son and daughter love the Disney version. I used to watch it a lot as a child. Not so much recently, but I do like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. That's
come on, I love the Disney version. I remember all the songs off by heart.
I never understood why Prince John was a lioness. That always confused me.
Yes, he didn't have a mane, did he? Anyway,
Richard did. Maybe that was the point they were making.
We digress. Yes, King John was hopeless. He didn't have a mane. King Richard came in at the end, didn't he, with his big mane and saved the day. Some might say he'd been a bit remiss for being off in the Crusades when everyone was struggling back in Nottingham. But anyway, back to Nottingham.
That is a separate podcast I'd love to do.
Separate podcast. Back to Nottingham, and in all the Robin Hood stories, the castle is an important part of those stories, and we will be talking a lot about the castle. But also, on a personal note, this is an interesting podcast for us because this is a city we've both lived and studied in.
Yes, once again, we have to declare an interest. It's not often we get to do that, but we were both at Nottingham University together. So yeah, it's a city we know well.
It is a city we know well. We know it from the perspective of a student, but we've also gone back quite a few times because, and we'll come back to this as well, it's such an important centre for sport. So if you're interested in football, cricket, ice hockey, that kind of thing, you'll find yourself in Nottingham. The way this podcast is structured, as regular listeners will know, is we explore the city in 4 categories. The first category is politics and war, which we'll be talking about in just a moment, and the castle will be important. The following categories will be science and industry, where we will get to talk about lace and some of the famous companies in Nottingham, like Boots. The third category is culture, so we'll get to talk about Robin Hood, and as ever, we'll talk about football. And the fourth category, urban landscape, is where we talk about the architecture, the layout of the city. It has some great buildings. It has some horrible buildings too. We often find that on the podcast. Maid Marian Way is not quite as nice as you might imagine. But before
does her name a disservice, I think people have said.
But before we get into the first category, politics and war, let's do a brief orientation with a chronological overview of the city. Nottingham is a large city. As usual, there's several ways of quoting the population. It's about 320,000 in the city limits, 770,000 in the urban area, and it sprawls to about 1 million if we include various adjacent settlements. It's a big urban region located in the East Midlands. It's about halfway up England. Derby just to the west. It sits on the River Trent, which is one of the longest rivers in England, and it's a key feature of the city. So it's a major city, Daniel, but what are its origins?
Well, Nottingham's origins go back to the Saxons when it was part of the Saxon kingdom of Mercia, and the city, as we know it today, was probably founded in what is now the Lace Market area of the city. There had been some earlier Bronze and Iron Age settlements in the area, and a Roman fort, I think, has been found in Broxtowe, but nothing of any significance for the Saxons. Now, at that time, Nottingham had its first town defences constructed, and it changed hands back and forth between the Saxons and the invading Danes. The latter made it a fortified burh within their area of control, known as the Danelaw. The town was recaptured by Saxons in about 920 by King Edward the Elder, son of Alfred the Great, who built a bridge across the River Trent, the first one, and the first city walls. It was also under the Saxons that Nottingham got its original name, Snottingham, possibly derived from an Anglo-Saxon people called Snottingus, that's been speculated, and their chief with the rather unbecoming name Snot.
It's not called Snottingham anymore.
No, it's not. The S was dropped to give the town its current name, which I'm sure the inhabitants are much happier with, because the next load of invaders, the Normans, had trouble pronouncing the sn sound at the beginning. Following the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror arrived in Nottingham in 1067, when its population, according to the Domesday Book, was around 1,000 to 1,500. William gave the land to his son and had the first proper castle built. As was pretty common with early Norman castles, it was a wooden Moss and Bailey construction. It was later rebuilt in stone under King Henry II. Quite importantly for the development of Nottingham, the Normans also planted a brand new town there, the French borough, next to the castle, and the two boroughs, the English borough, the original one, and the French borough, essentially grew alongside each other, next to one another, as one single town of Nottingham. But despite this, the town did remain pretty small in population and scale until the 18th century. Up till then, it covered the area now more or less incorporating today's city centre area between about Canal and Parliament Streets. And some 17th century maps suggest it may have actually declined in scale by then. However, after that, Nottingham underwent a huge industrial expansion. It became really the archetypal Victorian industrial city. For its inhabitants, Nottingham became in many ways a victim of its own commercial success. There was serious overcrowding in the city slums from the mid-18th to mid-19th centuries, even up in some cases till the 20th century, as the city was unable to expand its area effectively to absorb new migrants coming to work in particular, the lace industry. And as a result, this formerly picturesque town became arguably the city with the worst living conditions in the country or thereabouts. Imagine the very worst picture you have in your mind of deprived Dickensian English slum cities. That is Nottingham. A rapid sink into slime is the way one writer described it. However, once there was a municipal reform which allowed expansion of the city outwards, Nottingham did expand its area rapidly, first to the north, south and west, and it became a very large Victorian town. And it was later made a city in 1897 for Queen Victoria's Jubilee, and its industry continued to thrive. It diversified after the First World War from lace as its concentration to numerous smaller manufacturing trades. 3 companies in particular became particularly important and rose to national and international prominence: Boots, John Player cigarettes and Raleigh bicycles. Nottingham has since absorbed surrounding villages. There were boundary extensions in the 1930s and 1950s, and now places like Beeston, which are nominally separate towns near the university, are basically really suburbs of Nottingham in all but name now. Perhaps best known internationally as the mythical home of Robin Hood, Nottingham's history really is of a major industrial city, but as we'll see, with clear medieval origins, and I think it's going to give us a lot to talk about across many different eras of English history today.
A rapid sink into slime sounds a bit like my student digs at university in Nottingham. So a lot to talk about. You allude to the massive industrial expansion, and in many respects, Nottingham fits the mould of your typical industrial northern or Midlands city, but it does have some of the heritage features of a smaller medieval city in its layout and the castle, and I think this makes it an interesting place, as we will see. Our first category then is politics and war. Now, when you visit Nottingham, a major feature of the city is the Castle Rock, and on top of that rock, Nottingham Castle. Can you tell us about the castle and its significance?
Certainly. Nottingham Castle is, I think, undoubtedly the most famous landmark in Nottingham. You'll know it from the Robin Hood legends as the place of in most of the climactic confrontation between Robin and the Sheriff of Nottingham. And as you've said, it stands there majestically on the Castle Rock. The first castle was built by William the Conqueror. There might have been some fortification on the hill before then, and that was at the point that Nottingham was separated between this Norman or French borough around the castle and the older English area around the Lace Market. As with many other castles across England, it was rebuilt in stone by Henry II as part of a widespread rebuilding programme during his reign to help assert his authority over his kingdoms following the lawlessness of the anarchy, the civil war that had preceded his reign between his mother, Empress Matilda, and the previous King Stephen. Now, the rebuilt castle was extremely strong, not only because of this rebuilding, but also because of its position high up on that castle rock. There was a 13th century source which summed both these facts in its defence up as saying it was fortified by both art and nature, and in this way had no peer in the kingdom. It was also a very important strategic fortress for a long time, as it helped control the crossing over the Trent between northern and southern England, essentially helped control that border between the two parts of England. And the castle was also a royal residence. Richard III left for the Battle of Bosworth Field from here. He inspected his army on the market square before the battle. King John stayed here, and his son Henry III did a lot of redecorating around the place. It was later used by Edward III, parliaments, state councils were held there, and Princess, later Queen Anne, stayed here during the Glorious Revolution when she was fleeing to London to join her brother-in-law and oppose her father. Many royals were also held prisoner here. Scottish kings David II and James I of Scotland, plus Owen Glendower, or Owen Glendower, as my wife who's Welsh would have me say it, the Welsh rebel against English rule, and the last Welsh Prince of Wales.
So a lot of history, including Owen Glendower. But I've got to say, I think you might go to Nottingham and be slightly underwhelmed by the main castle building.
Yes, because, and this is very important, that original medieval castle, which housed all these people and all these events, that is no more. It had already started to fall to ruin by the 16th century, and it was blown up in 1651 after the Civil War, which was not an uncommon occurrence for castles at that time. Instead, what we have today has uncharitably been called a fake castle. It is really a mansion, was a stately home rather than a castle, because it was completely rebuilt. Essentially, a new building was built in the same place about 350 years ago. One writer, on first seeing it, said it turned out to be a house, and an ugly one at that, and an inferiority complex for the city residents who, he said, were embarrassed at visitors seeing it. Even in the 1790s, one historian wrote, as an object of admiration to the surrounding country, in union with the rock on which it stands, it falls very short of our wishes and expectation. Now, whether you think that's fair or not, there's no doubt. I think it fails to live up to the expectations imbued by this medieval myth and history that surrounds the place. But we should still talk about it because it receives lots of visitors. It's still the most famous place in Nottingham. Now, the present stately home was built by the owner, the Duke of Newcastle, when he was in his 80s, and subsequently burned by rioters in 1831 who were angry at the then Duke's opposition to electoral reform, which is in a fire which was portrayed in a painting by Henry Dawson. I should say, as a slight digression, it's pretty hard to have much sympathy for this Duke. He sounds like a pretty nasty piece of work. He inherited the castle and his Nottingham lands from his father. He led the opposition to protests against poverty in Nottingham. He opposed electoral reform and even evicted tenants in Newark who voted against his nominee in the election there. So you might not have much sympathy for him. However, he wasn't at the castle at the time, and the fire tragically burned 2 children to death. So it wasn't without consequences for others. Now, the castle as it was then renovated by later Victorians. The restored building essentially took the burned out shell, knocked 3 floors into 2, and added the first telephone in Nottingham. In more recent times, in the James Bond book Thunderball, it's featured in that. Pictures of the castle on its rock that appeared on John Player's cigarettes were described as a doll's house swimming in chocolate fudge in that book, which I think is a pretty fair description of it, from the at least from the depiction on the cigarettes.
So I'm going to defend the castle slightly. Yes, it does look like a giant house. It doesn't have the look of a medieval castle with high towers and ruined fortifications, because it's not. It's a more modern building. So I think it's pretty good. It's a great place to visit. It's got great views. It's got good art gallery, a lace exhibition. I think it's cool. But what I really want to do, Daniel, is I want to feel the historical importance of the place. Now, one of the features of Nottingham is these underground caves and things built into the rock. And I think there's some really important history that's gone on at this castle that really gets the essence of that. Can you tell us more about what happened with Edward III at the castle?
Certainly. There was a major event in royal and political history in England that happened in Nottingham. And you're absolutely right. It was really wrapped up in these underground tunnels and caves that were such a feature of the castle and its rock. I'll talk about the context here. Now, Edward III led a coup against Roger Mortimer in Nottingham Castle. It was hugely important to the future of medieval England and indeed Western Europe. It allowed perhaps the greatest medieval English king to claim the full powers of his title and his throne, to lead his country from the disastrous defensive foreign policy that was going on to one of conquest in France, and kickstart the restoration of royal authority, the 100 Years' War, and really the true age of high medieval chivalry as we think of it today. Now, to understand what was going on, we have to go back to Edward's father, Edward II, and his wife, Isabella of France. If it helps, if you've seen Braveheart, you can think of them as the prince and the princess, which by the logic of the film would make our protagonist Edward III Braveheart Jr., but we're not going to go there. Edward II's rule had been, to put it kindly, disastrous. He'd allowed his favourites and possible lovers to usurp other nobles and his queen in his affections, in authority and power. Isabella took her son to France on a mission, this being Edward III while he was Prince of Wales, and simply refused to bring him home. While she was there, she took Roger Mortimer, an exiled knight, as her lover, and the two returned to England at the head of an army. The English basically abandoned Edward II, and the king was captured by Mortimer and Isabella's forces, forced to abdicate in 1327, and probably murdered. After Edward II's abdication, his son, the teenage Edward III, became king, but really in name only. It was Roger and his mother Isabella who exercised power and kept Edward under their thumbs. They lavished wealth and titles upon themselves, and their weak administration made them make peace on very poor terms with both Scotland and France, and really risked undermining the whole concept of royal authority in England.
So Edward III, he's seeing Roger Mortimer and Isabella mess up the country, so he took action.
Yes.
What happened at Nottingham Castle?
Edward was put into the position of having to make a decision, and he decided he'd had enough. He decided to act. In October 1330, while he, Mortimer, and his mother were all at Nottingham Castle. Now, we've made this point, but I'll be more specific about it. The castle itself wasn't just an incidental location for this story. Its network of underground passages through the rock allowed Edward and around 20 of his young followers the secrecy to creep in on Mortimer, risking certain death and ruin if they were caught. Now, on the night of the coup, the men realised they had to act immediately because Mortimer had been warned there could be a plot against him, and he'd interrogated Edward about it that day. The leader of the coup persuaded the king to go ahead quickly, telling him in famous words, "It is better to eat dog than be eaten by the dog." Now, they had to creep through the tunnels with the help of the castle watchman, who was loyal to the king, because Mortimer controlled access to the castle and kept the keys under Isabella's pillow. The watchman had left the gate to the tunnel unlocked, allowing access directly to the castle keep. Now, all these plotters showed really incredible bravery. They were very young men. Edward himself was still only 17. And if Mortimer had heard about the plot, and as we've seen, he did have spies, he did have an inkling of it, it would have meant certain death if they'd been caught. Fortunately, he hadn't found out all the details, and after they crept up the staircase into Isabella's room, they found her, Mortimer's two sons, and a few others discussing exactly how to deal with the plot that was coming right at them at that moment. One of the men in the room, a bishop, ran out and tried to actually throw himself out via the toilet. Mortimer and his sons were arrested. Mortimer was bound and gagged for his trial in Westminster and sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Now, there's unfortunately no known remnant of the tunnels, or of course, very little of the medieval castle itself today. It is supposed that the plotters entered the castle through Mortimer's Hole, as it's known now, but it's thought more likely this was a goods entrance. But nonetheless, that does at least commemorate, even if in name only, this pivotal moment in English royal history, a great story, and is commemorated now in an exhibit at the revamped castle.
And you can really visualise that story if you visit, because you can walk around the castle, the caves underneath. There's a pub, the Old Trip to Jerusalem, built into the caves underneath. It's a real feature of the city. That's an incredible story. Edward was only 17. I must confess, as an 18-year-old, I was being far less productive. But times change, responsibilities change. And talking of change, we're going to move on to our next topic. Have you ever been called a Luddite?
Have I been called a Luddite? I don't think so.
Have you called anyone else a Luddite? Have you gone, oi, you Luddite?
Not recently, no. I think
you need a new phone, you Luddite. Well, the Luddites, the term Luddite is well used. The Luddites were a historical group, and who were the Luddites?
Well, the original Luddites were textile workers from the early 19th century, and they engaged in destruction of manufacturing technology that they thought was threatening their livelihoods through new ways of processing textiles. They were named after their mythical totemic leader, General Ludd, or King Ludd, sometimes he's known.
Oh, and what's their connection with Nottingham?
Well, the connection with Nottingham is a very important one, that the Luddite movement began in that city in 1811. The basis here is the hosier industry in Nottingham, in which people were very poorly paid with very little recourse or means of negotiation, especially when any attempts to unionise were effectively quashed at birth. Later, declining exports, changes in manufacturing processes, such as the introduction of new technologies, which the Luddites were so opposed to, did combine to both lower demand and lower wages. People started taking action in breaking the new knitting frames in 1811. Following a meeting on Market Square in Nottingham, gangs went round systematically smashing hundreds of frames in the town, targeting specifically those whose owners paid low wages or otherwise engaged in practices they thought were hostile to workers. And the Luddites used to meet in Sherwood Forest. You can certainly see the parallels with Robin Hood there, protecting the poor against the rich as they would have seen it, meeting in Sherwood Forest in a gang. And they would work in gangs of 6 up to 60. They'd position lookouts outside the workplaces. Others would go in and break the frames while the others were looking out for any interruptions.
Wow. What happened? How did the Luddite movement end?
Really through strong responses and reprisals in response to the Luddites in Nottingham. Business owners would post spies around the city to gather information, and a 10 p.m. curfew was imposed. As well, huge numbers of soldiers were drafted into Nottingham, and the punishments for those tried and found guilty were draconian. They included transportation for up to 14 years, including for children, until Parliament went further and passed a law making frame breaking a hanging offence. But still it continued. Hosiers and judges were threatened and trials were disrupted while workers continued to try negotiations. The movement was ultimately ended by this severe repression. There were mass trials, hangings and deportations. Now, you're absolutely right. We get the term Luddite from this movement today. It perhaps unfairly has these negative connotations of people opposed to technology and innovation, though the overall legacy of the Luddites is more mixed, and many are more sympathetic at seeing in it poor people standing up for their rights as poorly paid workers.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting history, actually. So my apologies then for anyone that I might have called a Luddite over the years. Another major important political event, I suppose, in Nottingham, and we touched on this a few times in the podcast, in the politics section, which is the impacts of discrimination following immigration and in particular race riots. So we spoke about this in the Liverpool episode with the 1981 riots in Toxteth a few episodes ago. Nottingham had some of the most significant race riots earlier, back in 1958. What occurred in Nottingham? In
1958, there were the St Anne's riots. They took place, as I said, in 1958, involving racist attacks, interracial fights and battles between racist gangs and the police. There were many factors that contributed to this. The previous post-war economic prosperity had led to mass migration, particularly from the Caribbean, but the availability of jobs had since diminished, and this was leading to tensions, competition for jobs, resentment, and prejudice. The initial spark for the riots was supposedly, though I should emphasise this is by no means known with any certainty, an assault on a black man who was with his white girlfriend. The escalation initially was racist attacks by white teddy boys on innocent black residents. This was followed later by revenge attacks by black gangs, many times on innocent white people. Crowds of hundreds of white people gathered, and events came to a head on the 30th of August 1958. Up to 4,000 white people were gathered, shouting racist slogans including "Find the N-word" and threatening to lynch black people, but mainly fighting with the police in the end when black residents didn't take the bait. The Nottingham Chief Constable, even today, if you read any reports of the riots, is criticised almost universally for his response, for being naive at best, for saying that the events of the 30th weren't a racial riot. But it's probably fair to give the full quote here. He was talking specifically about the events on the 30th and said, and please do excuse the dated language here, this was not a racial riot, but he also added the coloured people behaved in a most exemplary way by keeping out of the way. Indeed, they're an example to some of our rougher elements.
All right, so that's quite a complex point then, isn't it? It's quite a complex story here. So how much did these events reflect broader racism in society at the time?
These events were extreme, and there was certainly widespread agreement with the severe court sentences that were handed out to the rioters. But there's no doubt that more broadly, racial tensions and racist attitudes in particular were the fuel for this and for the better known Notting Hill riots that occurred in London a week later. Well, none of the mainstream political parties supported racially segregationist or discriminatory policies in relation to immigration or even Commonwealth restrictions on immigration at all. And there was usually outright hostility to the most extreme forms of racism in public life. 1958 was still 10 years before the Race Relations Act, so it was legal to discriminate in many areas of life, such as employment and housing on racial grounds. It was pretty commonplace for housing to be refused, either overtly or tacitly, to non-whites, and employment discrimination was common. Sometimes trade unions even would operate so-called colour quotas in employment. There was a national opinion poll conducted less than a week after the St Anne's riots, which showed 55% of people in favour of restrictions on non-white immigration specifically, and 71% disapproving of mixed-race marriage. So whatever the veneer, whatever the extremity of the events, hostility to racial integration was definitely there at this time.
And what was the legacy of these riots?
It's difficult to sum it up in one sentence or in one theme. Many reactions are positive about racial progress in Nottingham in the following years. St Anne's became more multicultural and integrated, which some people have compared with more segregated communities in other cities. But it's also tinged with the desire for these negative aspects of our past to be better known so we can learn from them. Maybe a better example of that racial integration in Nottingham can be found in one of the key figures in the subsequent years who helped advise the council on problems surrounding the St Anne's riots. Eric Irons, who was Britain's first black magistrate, appointed in Nottingham just 4 years after the riots in 1962. Born in Jamaica, Eric joined the RAF during the Second World War. He was posted to the UK and he lived in Nottingham, where he married a local woman. Now, Eric became a campaigner for equal rights on local issues. He campaigned locally against discrimination in the 1950s. In those years, after mass migration to the UK began leading up to St Anne's race riots, when such discrimination wasn't illegal. So an important figure, not just on a national, but particularly on a local level as well.
Good. That's a happier story about Eric Irons and such an impressive achievement. There was a picture of him displayed at the National Portrait Gallery in London and also at the Nottingham Contemporary. And yeah, he's an important figure in the city's history. He has a plaque at the National Justice Museum, which is located on High Pavement in the city centre. Now, I think we should talk about that museum. I went there about 20 years ago and it was called the Galleries of Justice, and it had a really great interactive tour when I went. Can you tell us a bit about the history of this centre, the National Justice Museum?
Certainly, you're right. It's one of Nottingham's main tourist attractions. We did indeed know it as the Galleries of Justice back when we were there, which was its name when the attraction opened in 1995. But the building does have a deeper history. It was the Shire Hall. It was later used as a Victorian police station, court, and a prison. That really gives it its selling point. You got all stages of the justice process in one place: arrest, trial, and imprisonment. If you visit now, you can see Victorian courtrooms with trial reenactments, a jail, and the execution site, including the country's last working gallows. It's also got pretty ghoulish exhibits like various execution tools, the dock from Bow Street Magistrates Court, where Oscar Wilde, Geoffrey Archer, Dr. Crippen, the Cray twins, among others, stood, and a bottle of whiskey which was used to give one final drink to anyone about to be executed.
It's all good fun in many ways. I think my brother was hung for treason when we visited, or at least sentenced for hanging for treason. I don't think he wasn't actually hung.
Was he guilty?
Thankfully. I think he was definitely guilty. Yes.
They got the right man then.
I think he stole something. Now, finally, on politics. Is it politics? I'm never really sure sometimes. We've got another man who cared very much about the poor, and unlike Robin Hood, we have abundant evidence of his existence. And this is William Booth, who was born and raised and probably inspired by Nottingham.
Certainly. William Booth, it might not be a name that's familiar to all of our listeners, but you will be familiar with the organisation he effectively refounded, the Salvation Army. Booth essentially created the organisation as it is today, and he was indeed born in Nottingham. The Salvation Army, it's an international Christian charity and church. It's aimed at practical applications of Christianity as they see it, by working in communities with the poor and needy. It was founded in London in the 1860s as the East London Christian Mission, but Booth and his wife Catherine, who also should be given credit for this, took over the organisation in 1878 and gave it a kind of pseudo-military structure with military ranks, uniforms, flags and hymns, with the name changing to the Salvation Army, which all is retained today. Members are known as soldiers or perhaps officers, while the leader of the Salvation Army is the general. Now, Booth was not only born in Nottingham, but he heard his earliest and most formative Christian teachings there. He preached on the street, he preached his first sermon there when a teenager, and he started working with the poor and needy in Nottingham. He summed up the Salvation Army mission in 3 words: soup, soap, salvation. His birthplace was in the Sneinton area of Nottingham near the city centre, and it's now a museum which you can visit, I think, 3 days per week by appointment.
And good brass bands as well in the Salvation Army. A huge amount of political history there. What about war? We often find in our older cities some big battle has occurred. Has Nottingham been the site of any important moments of war or battle?
Well, there was one very important moment. The Civil War began in Nottingham. Our old favourite, the Civil War.
The Civil War. We always talk about the Civil War.
We do, but it really does need a mention here because it did formally start in Nottingham. Now, if you read any history book that covers the Civil War, they all use the same phrase, that Charles I raised his standard at Nottingham to begin the war. Now, if you've ever read a history book and seen those 3 words, wonder what exactly it means. It just means that Charles decided at that moment, this is war, and issued a call for anyone who could bear arms northwards of the Trent and southwards 20 miles to join him. He then had a ceremonial act of planting his flag, i.e. raising his standard, in the ground at the already half-ruined castle. He stayed for 3 weeks there recruiting people. Despite this, during the Civil War, Nottingham was held by parliamentarian forces throughout the war. It was attacked by royalists several times, but unsuccessfully each time.
So another important event at the castle. And there's even more at the castle.
Yep. The anarchy, which also comes up a lot in the oldie guide. Anarchy, Nottingham suffered pretty heavily during the anarchy, which was the 12th century civil war for control of the English throne and of England between King Stephen and Empress Matilda, who, as we heard earlier, her son Henry II rebuilt the castle in stone. Nottingham Castle was held by Stephen's forces, but it was attacked by Matildas in 1141. They failed to capture the castle, but they did set fire to the city outside and massacred many inhabitants. Unfortunately, the city at this time had no major town defences. Its only defence was the castle. This meant that the inhabitants either fled or tried to take sanctuary in churches, but that was no protection to most of them. Many of them were massacred even in the churches.
Crikey. So generally a fair amount of fighting in or around the city one way or another, and it's a general theme, I suppose, of dissent.
Definitely. There is no doubt a history of dissent and disorder in Nottingham, whether it's the Luddites, the burning of the castle, St Anne's riots. There is this running theme, and there are other minor and major examples of this as well. In 1799, an army chaplain is quoted as saying that he'd seen 17 riots in the 17 years he'd been there, which really sums up what was going on in the city at the time. There are other 19th century examples of mass strike attempts and Chartist activity. The so-called Battle of Mapley Hills, for example, occurred in August 1842 on the outskirts of Nottingham. The context here is Chartist protest. Chartism was an early working-class mass movement aimed at electoral reform. Despite the 1832 Great Reform Act, Britain was far from a democracy. Women were still banned from voting, though female suffrage wasn't a Chartist demand. Unequal constituencies remained, and property ownership criteria were also there, which robbed the poor of any chance of standing as MPs. Now, the Battle of Mapley Hills wasn't a battle as such, but use of military force to break up a gathering of about 5,000 unarmed Chartists, similar in a way to the more famous Peterloo, though with fewer dead. After the Riot Act was read and the Chartists refused to leave, several hundred were arrested, though thankfully fewer deaths.
So there's been quite a lot of beef in and around Nottingham, one way or the other, and I think that brings us to concluding this section, Daniel, and we've had a lot to talk about. And what we do at the end of all of our sections is we give a score out of 10 for historical interest, and I think this has been quite interesting. What are your thoughts?
What I really like about Nottingham is not just that we've had so much to talk about, but that it covers so many different eras of British history, from epic medieval heroism myth to early modern working class dissent and modern themes of justice in the National Justice Museum. We could have even gone back further and talked about Nottingham's political role in the Danelaw if only there was more time. It only stays off the top scores because it hasn't always and consistently been a major national or international political powerhouse or had any enormously significant military action. But I should emphasise that Nottingham was one of the most strategically important cities in the Middle Ages, and I don't want to take away from that. So it's still going to be a very good score. I think Nottingham's going to get an 8 from me.
That's a good score, and I'm also going to give it an 8 because I've learned so much about the history of the castle, and I can sort of visualise it when I'm in the city, what occurred at that castle, the caves underneath, the market square, which is just down from the castle. You walk 5-10 minutes, and then you go up to the Galleries of Justice not far away, and you can feel the importance of that. So I think it's a great city to experience the history of politics and war in Britain going back many centuries. So I agree with you. It will be an 8 from me too.
Excellent. As a reminder, on the oldie guide, we start at 5, go up or down. So anything above 5 is a good score. So 8 is a very good score. And that's 16 out of 20 overall for politics and war. Great start, Nottingham.
Well, that's all we have time for today, but that was a fascinating first episode in our series on Nottingham. It's changed the way I think about the castle, the market square, and that's why I love making this podcast. Next time, we'll be exploring the industrial history of Nottingham. Lace, Boots the chemist, rally cycles, Players Tobacco, and of course, the universities. Following that, we will get round to talking about Robin Hood and the cultural history of the city, as well as its architecture and urban layout. All our episodes can be found at yeoldieguide.com, as well as all podcast directories. We love ratings or reviews. If you have time to leave us a rating or review, please do. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on Ye Oldie Guide.